The German armor officer stood motionless in the mud outside Minsk, staring at what should have been impossible. The captured T-34 sat before him like a verdict. Every angle on that Soviet tank violated every principle he had learned at Munster, every doctrine taught to the Panzer Corps, every confident assumption that had driven the Wehrmacht east. The sloped armor wasn't just different. It was a repudiation of everything German engineering had declared sacred. And in that moment, looking at the deflection marks where 88mm rounds had glanced off like thrown stones, he understood they had built the wrong army. July 1941. Army Group Center had been advancing for 3 weeks. The border battles had gone exactly as planned. Soviet formations shattered, thousands of tanks destroyed or captured. The numbers looked magnificent in Berlin, but the panzer crews who actually faced those tanks knew something the high command didn't. Some of those Soviet machines weren't dying, the T-34s especially. They appeared in small numbers at first, enough to be dismissed as flukes, not enough to change the narrative of German superiority. But every encounter left the same bitter residue. Rounds that should have penetrated simply didn't. Angles that exposed flanks on German panzers somehow deflected fire on the Soviet design. The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine on the Panzer III and I-4. Vertical armor, clean angles, precise engineering that looked beautiful in the factories and made perfect sense on the drawing boards. German metallurgy was superior. German optics were superior. German crew training was superior. These facts were not in dispute, but the T-34 rendered them insufficient. Not because it was better built. The Soviet welding was crude. The interior layout was cramped and awkward. The vision blocks were inadequate. By every measure of craftsmanship, the German tanks were refined machines, and the T-34 was a brutish compromise. Except the T-34 survived hits that gutted a Panzer IV, and survival was the only metric that mattered when the shooting started. The inspection team arrived in August. Senior engineers from the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Department, men who designed the armor that equipped the Reich's finest division. They came east with confidence bordering on arrogance. Whatever advantage the Soviets had stumbled into could be quantified, analyzed, and overcome. German science had no equal. They would examine this T-34, identify its secrets, and incorporate any worthwhile innovations into superior German designs. The process would be methodical. The conclusions would restore proper order to the hierarchy of nations. They anticipated a few days of measurements and metallurgical testing. What they got was a crisis of faith in their own expertise. The angled armor was the first shock, not the fact of it existing. Angled armor wasn't a new concept, but the degree of slope on the T-34's glacis plate created deflection angles German designers had rejected as impractical. The manufacturing complexity alone should have made it impossible for Soviet industrial capacity to produce. Yet here it was, welded crudely but effectively, and those welds had held against German 88mm guns at ranges where vertical armor would have been catastrophically penetrated. The engineers took measurements, calculated the effective thickness created by the slope, ran the numbers against known German ammunition performance. The mathematics were undeniable. A T-34 hit from the front presented armor equivalency far exceeding its actual thickness. The slope transformed 45mm of steel into something approaching the protection of 90mm of vertical plate. The second shock was the Christie suspension. The T-34 used large road wheels and a suspension system that gave it mobility German tanks couldn't match. The Panzer III and IV were precision instruments. Their suspensions were engineered for stability and accuracy on the move, but precision required complexity, and complexity created maintenance demands that became nightmares in Russian mud and winter cold. The T-34's suspension was almost barbarically simple. Fewer parts, easier maintenance, and in the field conditions of the Eastern Front, simpler meant operational. German tank battalions were already reporting mechanical breakdowns that left more panzers disabled than Soviet fire. The T-34's crude engineering was proving more durable than German sophistication. The third shock was the diesel engine. German tanks ran on gasoline, high-performance engines that delivered excellent power-to-weight ratios, but gasoline burned. Every panzer crewman knew the terror of a fuel tank ignition. One penetrating hit in the wrong place, and the crew had seconds to evacuate before the interior became an inferno. The T-34 used a diesel V2 engine. Diesel was far less flammable. It didn't eliminate the fire risk, but it dramatically reduced the instant catastrophic burns that killed German crews. The Soviet engine was also more fuel efficient, greater operational range, less vulnerability to supply line disruption, another crude advantage that outweighed German technical elegance. The senior engineer leading the inspection was a man named Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp. He had been instrumental in designing the Panzer III and IV. His reputation was built on those machines. Now, he stood inside a captured T-34, looking at the compromises Soviet designers had made and recognizing them as correct choices his own teams had rejected. The German tanks had better optics, superior crew ergonomics, more refined fire control systems. All true, all irrelevant when a tank couldn't survive the first exchange of fire. The T-34 sacrificed crew comfort and fighting efficiency for protection and mobility. In the abstract, that seemed like a bad trade. In actual combat on the Eastern Front, it was keeping Soviet crews alive while German crews burned. Kniepkamp's report reached Berlin in September 1941. It was not well received. The Wehrmacht was still advancing. Moscow seemed within reach. Losses were acceptable. The narrative of German superiority remained intact in the official assessments. But Kniepkamp's findings were unambiguous. German armor doctrine was based on faulty assumptions. The emphasis on vertical armor and mechanical complexity was producing tanks that were tactically inadequate for the Eastern Front. Immediate redesign was necessary. The Panzer III and IV could be upgraded, but the fundamental limitations of their vertical armor configuration meant they would always be vulnerable to capable opponents. Germany needed a new tank, one that incorporated sloped armor, simpler suspension, better survivability characteristics. They needed to learn from the T-34 without surrendering German technical advantages. The bureaucratic response was everything wrong with the Third Reich's industrial policy. Multiple agencies claimed authority over tank development. The army wanted one thing. The armaments ministry wanted another. Hitler himself had opinions that carried the force of law regardless of their technical merit. Kniepkamp and his team began work on a new medium tank that would eventually become the Panther. But the design process became a nightmare of competing requirements and political interference. Every advantage they tried to incorporate from the T-34 got layered with additional German demands for complexity and capability. The Panther would eventually emerge as a formidable machine, but it wouldn't reach the front in significant numbers until 1943. 2 years lost while German armor doctrine remained built around tanks the engineers already knew were inadequate. Meanwhile, the Panzer crews kept fighting. They adapted tactics to compensate for material deficiencies, flanking maneuvers to avoid frontal engagements with T-34s, ambush positions that allowed first-shot advantages, combined arms coordination that used anti-tank guns to stop what the Panzers couldn't penetrate. German tactical excellence was real. It bought time and victories, but tactics couldn't change the fundamental equation. When a Panzer IV and a T-34 met at equal terms, the Soviet tank had better survival odds. The crews knew it. Every engagement reinforced the lesson, and as 1941 turned to 1942, and the Wehrmacht failed to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, those survival odds began to matter more than tactical brilliance. The T-34 wasn't a perfect tank. Soviet crews complained about the two-man turret that overloaded the commander. The vision blocks were terrible. The transmission was prone to failure. Early models had issues with the clutch system that made them difficult to drive. German crews who captured operational T-34s and used them against their former owners reported the same deficiencies, but they also reported the strange confidence that came from sitting behind sloped armor. The psychological impact of knowing your tank could take hits that would kill the machine you'd been issued. That confidence was worth more than perfect optics or refined controls. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. German tank production in 1942 and 1943 became a race against recognition. The engineers knew what needed to be built. The Panther incorporated sloped armor and improved mobility. The Tiger offered overwhelming firepower and heavy protection. Both designs were responses to the T-34's lessons, but production was slow. Resources were diverted to other projects. The bombing campaign against German industry disrupted manufacturing, and the Wehrmacht kept sending Panzer IIIs and IVs east because those were the tanks available. Upgraded versions with better guns and thicker frontal armor helped, but the fundamental design limitations remained. You couldn't angle armor that was already welded vertical. You couldn't simplify a suspension that was already built complex. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was producing T-34s in staggering numbers. The tank was designed for mass production, simple components that didn't require highly skilled labor, factories that could be relocated beyond German bomber range. By 1943, Soviet tank production was outpacing German output by ratios that made qualitative advantages almost meaningless. A single Panther might be superior to a single T-34 in a technical comparison. But if the Panther faced 3 T-34s, The numbers decided the outcome, and the Soviets had the numbers. The crude engineering that German inspectors had initially dismissed as inferior was exactly what allowed production at scale. There was a Panzer IV commander named Otto Carius, who later wrote about encountering T-34s in 1943. His crew had learned to target the turret ring, a weak point where the sloped armor didn't protect. One precise shot could disable the turret traverse and mission kill the Soviet tank. It required excellent shooting and usually a flanking position to get the angle. When it worked, it felt like mastery. The validation that German gunnery skill could overcome material disadvantage. But Carius also wrote about the grinding reality that skill only mattered when you had ammunition and your tank was operational, and you hadn't already been hit. The T-34s kept coming, more of them every month, and each engagement was rolling dice against odds that slowly shifted against survival. The deeper crisis was doctrinal. German armor theory had been built around quality over quantity. Elite formations equipped with superior machines executing sophisticated maneuvers. It was elegant. It worked brilliantly in France. It worked in the opening phases of Barbarossa, but it required winning quickly. Decisive battles that shattered enemy armies before attrition became the deciding factor. The T-34 didn't just challenge German tank design, it challenged the entire operational concept. Soviet doctrine accepted losses that German planning considered catastrophic. Tanks were tools to be expended in achieving objectives. Crew survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. It was brutal, but it was sustainable in ways German precision warfare was not. The engineers who inspected that first captured T-34 understood this faster than the generals. They saw a tank designed for a different kind of war. Not the rapid maneuver campaigns Germany had perfected, but grinding attritional combat where durability and production capacity mattered more than individual technical superiority. Germany couldn't build that kind of army. The industrial base wasn't large enough. The resource access wasn't sufficient. The ideological framework that demanded every German weapon be a masterpiece of engineering made mass production of crude but effective designs philosophically impossible. So they built Panthers and Tigers, magnificent machines that were never available in the numbers needed. And they kept upgrading the Panzer IV because stopping production of an inadequate design meant accepting you had no replacement ready. By 1944, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare for German armor. The Soviets had not only numerical superiority, but had refined T-34 production into the T-34-85 variant, larger turret, better gun, three-man turret crew that solved the commander overload problem. It still wasn't as technically sophisticated as a Panther, but it was good enough. And there were thousands of them. German tank battalions that had once broken Soviet formations with aggressive maneuvers now fought defensive battles trying to slow inevitable advances. The tactical skill was still there. German crews were still among the best trained in the world, but no amount of training changed the mathematics of attrition when you were outnumbered 5-1 and your supply lines were collapsing. The Panther itself became a symbol of the disconnect between German engineering excellence and strategic reality. It was a genuinely formidable tank, sloped armor that rivaled the T-34, a long 75mm gun that could kill any Allied tank at range. Good mobility when it ran properly. In technical specifications, it was superior to the T-34-85, but it was mechanically complex. The transmission was notoriously unreliable. The final drive failed so frequently that Panther units expected to lose tanks to breakdowns at rates that would have been unacceptable in any other army. And it was expensive. The resources to build one Panther could have produced 3 or 4 upgraded Panzer IVs. Maybe those IVs were inferior in combat, but they could be in 3 or 4 places simultaneously. They could absorb losses and be replaced faster. There was a certain tragedy in watching German engineering consume itself. The men who designed these tanks were brilliant. The manufacturing quality was exceptional when resources allowed, but brilliance applied to the wrong problem produces elegant failures. The T-34 was never going to win awards for craftsmanship. Soviet quality control was inconsistent at best, but it was designed to be built quickly by workers with minimal training and to be operated by crews with minimal peacetime experience. It accepted compromises German engineers found offensive, and those compromises were exactly what made it effective. War doesn't reward perfection. It rewards adequate solutions delivered in overwhelming numbers. The reports from the initial T-34 inspection kept circulating through German technical circles throughout the war. Young engineers joining the Ordnance Department would read Kniepkamp's findings and recognize the strategic implications. But recognition didn't translate to change. The industrial commitments had been made. The factories were tooled for existing designs. Shifting production meant months of lost output. and Germany was already losing the production race by 1942. Every month spent retooling was a month of reduced tank availability. So they built what they could build and tried to make incremental improvements and hoped tactical excellence would compensate for strategic inadequacy. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The human cost of this engineering failure was measured in burned-out panzers and crews who never made it out. Every tank knocked out, because its vertical armor couldn't deflect an otherwise survivable hit, represented men who died from design decisions made years earlier. The crews didn't know about the debates in Berlin. They didn't know about Kniepkamp's reports, or the bureaucratic fighting over the Panther's development. They knew their tank could be penetrated frontally by guns that couldn't penetrate a T-34 from the same angle. They knew the diesel T-34s didn't brew up the way their gasoline-powered Panzers did, and they climbed into those inadequate machines anyway, because that was the war they were given. There were moments of dark humor. Crews would paint kill rings on captured T-34s they managed to get running, using Soviet tanks against Soviet forces because the captured equipment was better than what German factories had issued. Those T-34s became prized possession. Units would fight over salvage rights after battles. The crude interior everyone had mocked suddenly seemed less important than the protection it offered. German mechanics learned to maintain the Soviet engines. Ammunition was scrounged from destroyed Soviet vehicles, and for brief periods, German crews got to experience what it felt like to have the material advantage. But captured tanks didn't change the strategic balance. They were battlefield improvisations, temporary solutions that highlighted the permanent problem. Germany needed to be producing its own equivalent to the T-34 in 1941, not developing it in 1942, not fielding it in limited numbers in 1943, producing it at scale from the moment the first inspection reports came back. That would have required abandoning the existing Panzer III and IV production lines. It would have required accepting that German engineering had been wrong about fundamental design principles. It would have required humility that the Third Reich's leadership structure made impossible. The post-war analysis would identify the T-34 as one of the most influential tank designs in history, not because it was perfect, but because it understood the actual requirements of armored warfare better than its more sophisticated opponents. Protection, mobility, firepower, and the ability to be produced in massive quantities. Everything else was secondary. The Germans had prioritized crew comfort, optical precision, mechanical refinement, and individual unit superiority. All good things, none of them decisive. The T-34's designers made the hard choices about what to sacrifice. German designers kept trying to have everything and ended up with tanks that excelled in categories that didn't determine victory. There's a broader lesson embedded in this story about the relationship between technical excellence and strategic success. Germany had the better engineers by almost any measure. The metallurgy was superior. The optics were superior. The fire control systems were more advanced. These weren't propaganda claims. They were objectively measurable advantages. But those advantages were applied within a doctrinal framework that misunderstood the nature of the war Germany was fighting. The T-34 wasn't designed by better engineers. It was designed by engineers who better understood their strategic constraints. Limited industrial capacity, massive manpower reserves, a need to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. The tank they created reflected those realities. The German engineers who inspected that captured T-34 in 1941 saw all of this. Their reports were clear. The recommendations were sound, but sound recommendations implemented too slowly might as well be ignored. The Panther reached the front in summer 1943, 2 years after the inspection that should have triggered its immediate development. By then, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had already shifted. Kursk would be the last major German offensive. After that came retreat and defensive battles and the slow grinding collapse of the Wehrmacht's eastern armies. Would earlier Panther production have changed the outcome? Probably not. The Soviet Union's numerical advantages and industrial capacity were too overwhelming. But it might have bought time. It might have inflicted enough losses to delay Soviet offensives. Might have. The men who designed the Panzer III and IFU weren't incompetent. They were working within constraints and assumptions that made sense before the war started. Mobile warfare against opponents who would collapse under aggressive maneuver. Tank battles decided by superior gunnery and tactics. Engagements where quality equipment in skilled hands would dominate numerically superior, but less capable opponents. France validated all of it. The opening weeks of Barbarossa seemed to validate it again, but the T-34 was the anomaly that broke the model. a tank that shouldn't have existed according to German assumptions about Soviet industrial capacity, that shouldn't have been effective given its crude construction, that shouldn't have survived given German tactical excellence. But it existed, and it was effective, and it survived. And every month of 1941 that passed without fundamental German doctrinal changes made eventual defeat more inevitable. The panzer crews who fought through 1942 and 1943 developed a fatalistic respect for the T-34. It wasn't personal. The Soviet crews were just men doing their jobs like anyone else. But that tank represented an opponent that wouldn't quit. You could knock out 5 T-34s and 6 more would appear. You could win the engagement and fall back and face them again the next day. The individual battles might favor German tactical skill, but the campaign favored whoever could replace losses faster, and Germany couldn't match Soviet production. Not even close. There were German veterans who survived the war and later wrote about their experiences. Many mentioned the T-34 specifically, not usually as the best tank they faced. The later Soviet heavy tanks and the American Shermans all had their own challenges. But the T-34 was the tank that appeared everywhere, in every battle, in numbers that made tactical victories feel hollow. It was the grinding mechanical representation of Soviet industrial capacity. A reminder that Germany had picked a fight with an opponent whose resources made German technical superiority strategically irrelevant. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The doctrine that the T-34 broke wasn't just about tank design, it was about how Germany conceptualized modern warfare. The Wehrmacht's pre-war planning assumed short, decisive campaigns, overwhelming initial strikes that destroyed enemy combat power before industrial capacity became relevant. It worked when the opponent was France or Poland, nations that could be defeated before they fully mobilized, but the Soviet Union was too large, the industrial base was too distributed, the population reserves were too deep. German planning had no answer for an opponent who could absorb millions of casualties and continue fighting. The T-34 was designed for exactly that kind of war. A war where initial defeats didn't matter, because the factories would keep producing and the manpower would keep coming. The engineers knew this in 1941. The initial inspection reports didn't just criticize German tank design. They questioned the entire operational concept. But questioning doctrine was dangerous in the Third Reich, especially when the questioning implied that the war in the East might not be winnable through tactical excellence alone. So the reports got filed, and the recommendations got noted, and production continued on, designs everyone knew were inadequate. Political considerations overrode technical judgment. The need to maintain confidence in German superiority prevented acknowledgement that Soviet design philosophy was more appropriate to the conflict. By 1945, the Eastern Front had collapsed completely. Soviet tank armies were driving through Poland into Germany itself. Those armies were equipped primarily with T-34-85s and heavier IS-2s. German resistance was fierce in places. Individual units still fought with skill and determination, but the material balance had shifted so completely that skill couldn't compensate. A company of Panthers might stop a Soviet battalion temporarily, but the Soviets had more battalions, and the Germans had no more companies in reserve. The industrial war Germany had tried to avoid through quick victory had arrived anyway, and Germany had built the wrong tools for that kind of fight. The final irony was that German engineering eventually did produce tanks superior to the T-34. The late-war Panthers with improved transmissions were formidable machines. The Tiger II was nearly invincible frontally, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. The war was being decided by logistics and industrial output. Battles were being won or lost based on fuel availability and spare part supply. The technical specifications of individual tanks mattered less than whether those tanks could reach the battlefield and whether they could be kept operational once they got there. Soviet logistics were crude but functional. German logistics were collapsing under Allied bombing and partisan attacks. The superior tank that couldn't reach the front might as well not exist. There's a photograph from the war's end that captures the entire story. A destroyed Panther sitting next to a destroyed T-34 somewhere in the ruins of Berlin. Both tanks knocked out, both crews gone. From the image alone, you couldn't tell which had the better armor angle or superior optics. You couldn't determine which crew was better trained. All you could see was that both had been destroyed in a city that was falling, regardless of how good the defending tanks were. The strategic outcome had been determined by factors far beyond the technical merits of armored vehicles, but those technical merits had helped determine how many men died along the way. The German engineers who inspected that first T-34 in 1941 tried to prevent some of those deaths. Their reports were accurate, their recommendations were sound. They identified the crisis early enough that changes might have mattered. But changing course required an institutional flexibility the Third Reich didn't possess. Hitler's regime ran on certainty and dominance. Admitting Soviet engineering had gotten something fundamentally right would have challenged the racial ideology that justified the entire war. So the truth got buried under politically acceptable lies, and men kept dying in tanks everyone knew were inadequate. Post-war, some of those engineers ended up working for the Allies. Their expertise was valuable despite the side they'd served. NATO tank development incorporated lessons from both German and Soviet wartime experience. The sloped armor of the T-34 became standard, but so did the sophisticated fire control of German designs. The crude reliability of Soviet engineering merged with Western quality control. The next generation of tanks tried to have it all: protection and firepower and mobility and maintainability. They weren't constrained by wartime resource limitations or ideological blindness. They could learn from everyone's mistakes. But for the men who fought in 1941 through 1945, those future developments were irrelevant. They went to war in the tanks their nations built. They faced opponents in the machines those opponents produced. And the quality of those machines influenced who lived and who died in ways the crews only partially controlled. A T-34 crew that took a frontal hit from an 88 might survive, where a Panzer IV crew facing the same Soviet gun would not. Not because of anything those specific crews did, but because of decisions made by engineers and bureaucrats years earlier, in factories and design bureaus those crews would never see. The broken doctrine wasn't fixable at the crew level. Individual tankers couldn't angle armor that was welded vertical. They couldn't simplify a suspension that was already complex. They couldn't change their gasoline engines to diesel or their 200-mile range to 400. All they could do was fight with what they had and try to survive long enough to go home. Some did, most didn't. And the difference often came down to whether the tank they were sitting in had been designed correctly for the war they were actually fighting. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The T-34 remained in service long after the war ended. The Soviets exported it to Allied nations around the world. It fought in Korea. It fought in the Middle East. It showed up in conflicts through the 1960s and beyond. Not because it was still the best tank available, but because it was reliable and cheap and good enough for nations that couldn't afford cutting-edge equipment. That longevity proved the original design philosophy: build something adequate that can be produced at scale and maintained under field conditions. Technical sophistication is wonderful when you can afford it, but adequacy in quantity beats perfection in scarcity. The German tanks that fought the T-34 mostly ended their service in 1945. A few Panthers and Tigers survived as museum pieces or monuments, but the designs themselves were dead ends, too complex, too resource-intensive, unsuited for the realities of modern industrial warfare. NATO didn't build improved Panthers or Tigers. They built new tanks that learned from the T-34's lessons while incorporating what German engineering had gotten right. The synthesis was better than either original, but it came too late for the men who needed it during the war. There's no monument to the German engineers who tried to warn their leadership about the T-34. No memorial for Heinrich Kniepkamp and his team who wrote reports nobody in power wanted to read. They were buried in the general catastrophe of the Third Reich's collapse. Their expertise was just one more resource wasted by a regime that valued ideology over reality. Some survived to contribute to post-war developments. Some didn't. Either way, their wartime warnings went unheeded while it mattered. The crews who fought in inadequate tanks didn't have the luxury of blaming doctrine or bureaucracy. They had missions to complete, and enemies to engage, and very limited time to make life or death decisions. Whether their tank had vertical or sloped armor was academic when Soviet guns were firing. You fought with what you had. You used tactics that compensated for material weaknesses, and you hoped your skill would overcome the engineering disadvantages your side had built into your equipment. Sometimes it did. Usually it didn't. The mathematics of armored combat were unforgiving. One Panzer commander described the experience of watching rounds bounce off a T-34's glasses, while his own tank's frontal armor was vulnerable to the same Soviet gun. The psychological impact was immediate and crushing. You weren't fighting on equal terms. Your opponent had a fundamental advantage before tactics or skill entered the equation. You could still win through better positioning or better shooting or better coordination with supporting units, but you were starting from behind. And in a long war of attrition, starting every engagement from behind was a death sentence for your unit, even if you personally survived any particular battle. The Soviet crews probably felt similar watching German tactical skill in action. A well-handled Panzer IV in good terrain with an experienced crew was still dangerous despite its material limitations. The German advantage in crew training and tactical doctrine was real. A T-34 crew facing a veteran German unit wasn't safe just because they had better armor angles, but the T-34's design gave them a fighting chance in situations where a Panzer IV crew would have simply died. That margin mattered over thousands of engagements. It meant slightly more Soviet crews surviving their first battles, slightly more experienced tankers staying alive to pass on lessons, small percentages that accumulated into strategic advantage over years of combat. The war in the East was decided by accumulation. Tiny advantages repeated across millions of interactions. Better armor angles saving one crew in 10. Simpler maintenance keeping 5% more tanks operational. Greater fuel efficiency extending operational radius by 50 miles. None of these things won individual battles decisively, but they shifted the odds. And when you're fighting a multi-year campaign across thousands of miles with millions of men engaged, shifting the odds matters more than any single brilliant tactical innovation. Germany needed its engineers to shift those odds in 1941. They needed someone in authority to read the T-34 inspection reports and recognize that fundamental changes were necessary immediately, not eventually. Not after political considerations were addressed, not after the current production runs were complete. Immediately. Stop the line, retool for sloped armor, accept the production delays as necessary costs. Build the tanks the war actually required instead of the tanks doctrine pretended would be sufficient. It didn't happen. Couldn't happen within the system that existed. So the war continued with the equipment both sides actually had, and the side with adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantity ground down the side, with superior equipment produced in insufficient numbers. The tactical excellence that Germany's army demonstrated throughout the war bought time. But time ran out eventually. And when it did, the engineering decisions made in 1941 were part of why the outcome was never really in doubt after that first winter failed to break the Soviet Union. The T-34 broke German armor doctrine by existing, by demonstrating that Soviet engineering could produce a tank that challenged German technical superiority, by proving that crude but effective beat sophisticated but vulnerable, by showing that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity mattered more than individual unit quality. The German engineers who inspected that first captured example saw all of this. They understood the implications. They tried to sound the alarm, but the alarm was drowned out by confidence that refused to acknowledge unwelcome truths. And that refusal killed men who deserved better from the system they served. The story doesn't end with a clean lesson or simple moral. War is too complicated for that. The T-34 had advantages, but it wasn't invincible. German tactical skill mattered, but it wasn't sufficient. Better engineering decisions in 1941 might have changed individual battles, but probably wouldn't have changed the war's ultimate outcome. The Eastern Front was decided by industrial capacity and manpower reserves and strategic depth that Germany couldn't match regardless of how good their tanks were. But within that larger strategic inevitability, tank design mattered to the men who lived or died based on whether their armor could deflect incoming fire. To them, the angle of the glacis plate was the difference between going home and burning alive in a metal coffin. To them, the engineering decisions made years earlier in factories they'd never seen determined their survival odds in ways completely beyond their control. And to them, the knowledge that their leadership had been warned and had chosen not to act must have felt like betrayal, even if nobody ever said it that way. The T-34 wasn't just a tank, it was a verdict on everything Germany's military had assumed about modern warfare. And that verdict was delivered in armor angles and deflected rounds and burning panzers all across the Eastern Front for 4 years of industrial slaughter. The engineers tried to tell them. The reports were clear. But clarity doesn't matter when the people who need to hear it refuse to listen. And by the time the refusal ended, it was far too late to matter. The institutional blindness that prevented Germany from adapting to the T-34 threat ran deeper than simple bureaucratic inefficiency. It was embedded in the very structure of how the Third Reich approached technological development. Hitler himself interfered constantly in weapons design, demanding features that looked impressive on paper, but created nightmare complications in production. The Panther's development became a case study in how not to manage military procurement. Every department had input. Every general had opinions. Every political faction tried to steer the design toward their preferred specifications. What should have been a straightforward response to the T-34 became a years-long committee process that delivered a magnificent tank too late and in too few numbers to change anything. The competing visions for what the Panther should be reflected fundamental confusion about Germany's strategic position. Some wanted a medium tank that could be produced quickly to replace losses. Others demanded a heavy breakthrough vehicle that could dominate any opponent. The final design tried to satisfy both requirements and ended up with a 45-ton monster classified as a medium tank. It was heavier than the Soviet KV-1 heavy tank. It required a massive engine that consumed fuel at rates the Wehrmacht's logistics couldn't sustain. The transmission had to handle stresses it wasn't designed for, which explained the constant mechanical failures. All because nobody in authority could make the hard choice to prioritize one capability over another. The T-34 succeeded because Soviet designers made those hard choices ruthlessly. Crew comfort was sacrificed for armor protection. Optical quality was sacrificed for production speed. Mechanical refinement was sacrificed for battlefield durability. Every decision optimized for the actual conditions of the Eastern Front, rather than abstract ideals of tank excellence. The result was a machine that fit its purpose, even if that purpose was brutal and unforgiving. German designers kept trying to build the perfect tank. Soviet designers built the adequate tank and then built 10,000 of them. There was a German tank ace named Kurt Knispel, who reportedly destroyed over 160 enemy vehicles during the war. His kill count included dozens of T-34s. He knew every weak point on the Soviet tank: the turret ring, the lower glacis where the angle decreased slightly, the engine deck. He could put rounds through those vulnerabilities with mechanical precision. But even Knispel recognized that individual skill couldn't compensate for systemic material imbalance. You could be the best shot in the Wehrmacht and still die because your tank broke down 50 miles from the combat zone, or because you ran out of ammunition, or because the 5th T-34 in the engagement got a shot after you'd killed the first 4. Skill extended survival. It didn't guarantee it. The mathematical reality of armored warfare on the Eastern Front was unforgiving. German tank production in 1943 was roughly 5,000 vehicles. Soviet production that same year was over 20,000. Even if every German tank was twice as effective as its Soviet equivalent, the numbers didn't balance. And the Germans weren't twice as effective once the T-34-85 entered service. They had advantages in specific categories: better trained crews on average, superior tactical doctrine at the small unit level, more effective combined arms coordination when the resources existed to implement it properly. But those advantages were marginal, not overwhelming, and marginal advantages don't overcome 4-to-1 numerical inferiority. The panzer crews understood this better than their commanders. The men actually fighting the battles could see the mathematics playing out in front of them. Every engagement depleted German strength permanently. A destroyed Panther might eventually be replaced if logistics held and production continued, and the crew survived to receive a new tank. But probably it wouldn't be replaced. Probably the crew would be reassigned to a Panzer IV or a captured vehicle or an assault gun because Panthers weren't available. Meanwhile, every destroyed T-34 was replaced within weeks. The Soviet industrial machine treated tanks as consumable ammunition. Build them fast, crew them with whoever was available, send them to the front, replace losses immediately, repeat until the enemy couldn't sustain the exchange ratio. There were moments when German engineering superiority produced tactical miracles. A single Tiger tank holding off an entire Soviet tank battalion because nothing the Soviets fired could penetrate its frontal armor at range. Or a Panther company destroying dozens of T-34s in a defensive engagement through superior gunnery and positioning. These victories felt real. They proved German capability in ways that reinforced pre-war assumptions about quality over quantity. But they were anomalies, exceptional circumstances where German advantages could be fully leveraged. The typical engagement wasn't a prepared defensive position with clear fields of fire and plentiful ammunition. It was a confused meeting engagement in bad terrain, with fuel running low and half your unit already lost to mechanical breakdown. The T-34's mechanical simplicity became more valuable as the war progressed and German logistics deteriorated. Soviet tanks could be maintained by crews with minimal training using basic tools. Field repairs that would have required depot-level facilities for a Panther could be accomplished on a T-34 with a hammer and determination. The crude engineering that German inspectors had mocked in 1941 meant T-34s stayed operational under conditions that sidelined more sophisticated designs. When your supply lines are under constant partisan attack and your maintenance units are understaffed and undersupplied, mechanical simplicity is a combat multiplier more valuable than perfect optical quality. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The human cost of Germany's doctrinal failure accumulated in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Every crew sent into combat in an inadequate tank represented a choice made by people who knew better. The reports existed, the data was clear, but institutional inertia and political considerations meant those crews fought with equipment the experts had already identified as insufficient. Some survived through skill or luck, many didn't, and the survivors carried the knowledge that their friends had died in tanks that could have been better if different choices had been made years earlier. There's a specific kind of bitterness that comes from losing for preventable reasons. Military defeats happen, equipment fails, plans go wrong, but there's an acceptance that comes with losing to a superior opponent who simply outfought you. The Eastern Front didn't offer that comfort. German crews weren't being outfought in most tactical engagements. They were being overwhelmed by an opponent who could absorb catastrophic losses and continue attacking. Who could replace destroyed units faster than Germany could inflict the destruction? Who had built an entire military doctrine around accepting casualties that would have broken any other nation's will to fight? The T-34 was the mechanical embodiment of that doctrine. It wasn't designed to preserve its crew. Soviet tanker casualties were horrific throughout the war. The survival rate for T-34 crews was terrible by any objective measure. But the tank was designed to be crewed by replacements and sent back into combat. The individual crew was expendable. The tank itself was expendable. Only the cumulative mass of Soviet armor advancing westward was actually important. German doctrine couldn't conceptualize warfare on those terms. The Wehrmacht's entire structure was built around preserving combat effectiveness. Veteran crews were treasured assets. Experienced commanders were irreplaceable. The idea of treating trained men as disposable resources was philosophically unacceptable. But unacceptable or not, it was effective. The Soviet Union could sustain the casualty rates they suffered because their population and industrial base made the math work. Germany couldn't. Every experienced crew lost was a permanent degradation of combat capability. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was sending teenagers with minimal training into combat in tanks they barely knew how to operate. The tactical excellence that had defined German armor operations in 1941 was gone, burned away in 3 years of attrition. What remained was desperation and determination and equipment that was still inadequate for the missions assigned. The late-war German experience on the Eastern Front was characterized by fighting brilliant delaying actions that accomplished nothing strategic. A company would hold a critical road junction against overwhelming odds, destroy dozens of Soviet vehicles, delay the advance by 6 hours or 12 hours or a full day, then fall back because they were out of ammunition or outflanked or simply exhausted. The tactical victory was real. The strategic irrelevance was also real. Soviet operations didn't depend on any single road junction. They had the resources to bypass strong points or simply batter them into submission through artillery and massed assault. Time wasn't on Germany's side. Every day of delay came at a cost the Wehrmacht couldn't afford while buying time that didn't change the inevitable outcome. The Panther's combat record reflected this disconnect between tactical capability and strategic futility. In direct combat, Panthers had favorable kill ratios against T-34s. A well-maintained Panther with a trained crew could dominate engagements within its operational capabilities. But operational capability required fuel and spare parts and maintenance support that increasingly didn't exist. Panthers broke down en route to combat. They sat immobilized for lack of spare final drives. They were abandoned when fuel ran out 50 miles from the nearest supply depot. The combat record looked impressive because it only counted the Panthers that actually reached the battlefield and remained operational during engagements. It didn't count the ones that never got there or broke down before they could contribute. The T-34's record was less impressive per vehicle, but more relevant strategically. Individual T-34s were knocked out in huge numbers. Soviet tanker memoirs are filled with stories of burning out of multiple tanks during their service. But the tanks were replaced. The crews were replaced. The advance continued. There's a Soviet veteran named Dmitry Losa who wrote about receiving American-supplied Sherman tanks and preferring them to the T-34 for crew survivability. But he also noted that availability mattered more than preference. You fought in whatever tank was delivered. If it got destroyed, they gave you another one. The industrial capacity existed to sustain that approach. For Germany, it didn't. The doctrinal lessons from the T-34 extended beyond just tank design into fundamental questions about how to wage industrial warfare. Germany's entire military tradition emphasized elite formations, superior training, and technological excellence. That tradition had worked when warfare was decided by relatively small professional armies fighting limited campaigns. But World War II was total war on a scale that made traditional German approaches obsolete. The T-34 represented a different philosophy: mass production, acceptable losses, overwhelming numerical superiority achieved through industrial capacity rather than tactical brilliance. It was a philosophy built for the kind of war the Eastern Front became. German commanders who recognized this faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't change their industrial base or population size. They couldn't transform the Wehrmacht into a conscript mass army designed to absorb casualties like the Red Army. The cultural and political structures of the Third Reich prevented that kind of adaptation. So they fought the war with the tools available and tried to make tactical excellence compensate for strategic inadequacy. Sometimes it worked long enough to matter locally, never long enough to matter strategically. The mathematics were too unforgiving. There were German veterans who survived and later reflected on what could have been different, most focused on specific battles or decisions. If they'd had more Panthers at Kursk, if the offensive had started earlier, if logistics had been better organized, the tactical what-ifs where different choices might have produced different outcomes. But the deeper truth was that the war was probably unwinnable once the Soviet Union survived the initial invasion. The T-34 was both symptom and cause of that reality. It was a symptom of Soviet industrial capacity that Germany couldn't match, and it was a cause of German casualties that accumulated into strategic defeat. The crews who died in Panzer IIIs and Ivars, while better designs sat delayed in development, didn't have the luxury of strategic perspective. They knew the tank in front of them could deflect rounds their own tank couldn't. They knew Soviet production meant facing more enemies every week. They knew the fuel situation was getting worse, and spare parts were increasingly scarce. But they also knew their duty and their mission, and their brothers fighting beside them. So they kept fighting in inadequate equipment because that was what soldiers did. And they died in numbers that could have been reduced if the engineering warnings from 1941 had been heeded when they mattered. The true tragedy of the T-34's impact on German doctrine wasn't that it couldn't be countered. The Panther did counter it effectively when it worked. The tragedy was that the counter came too late and in too few numbers because institutional systems prevented rapid adaptation. The Third Reich's military-industrial complex was too rigid to respond to unexpected challenges quickly. Too many competing authorities, too much political interference, too much commitment to existing programs that couldn't be abandoned without admitting error. The Soviet system was crude and brutal, but it could make decisions quickly and implement them across the entire industrial base. Build more T-34s. Upgrade the gun. Deploy immediately. The refinements could come later. Getting adequate tanks to the front now mattered more than perfect tanks sometime in the future. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. By late 1944, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare of collapsing defensive lines and desperate counterattacks that accomplished nothing permanent. German armor units that had once spearheaded offensives across hundreds of miles now fought to delay Soviet advances by hours. The Panthers and Tigers that did reach the front were often used as static pillboxes because fuel shortages prevented mobile operations. The entire doctrine of armored warfare that Germany had pioneered was rendered irrelevant by resource constraints. You can't execute maneuver warfare when your tanks can't move for lack of fuel. You can't preserve your veteran crews when casualties outpace replacement. You can't maintain combat effectiveness when your supply lines are collapsing. The Soviet advance wasn't elegant, it was methodical and brutal and overwhelming. Artillery preparation that turned entire grid squares into moonscapes. Infantry assaults that accepted horrific casualties to achieve objectives. Tank armies that rolled forward regardless of losses because more tanks were always coming from the factories. German tactical skill could disrupt this machine locally. A well-executed ambush could destroy a Soviet battalion. A determined defensive position could hold against multiple assaults. But the machine didn't care about local disruptions. It ground forward because it could afford to, because Soviet industrial capacity and manpower reserves made the casualty exchange ratios sustainable. The T-34's role in this grand strategic dynamic was fundamental. It was the mass-produced tool that enabled Soviet operational doctrine. Without the T-34, Soviet armor forces would have been equipped with lighter tanks that couldn't stand up to German anti-tank weapons, or with heavy tanks that couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers. The T-34 hit the exact balance point between capability and producibility that the war required. It wasn't the best tank in any single category, but it was good enough in every category that mattered, and it could be built in quantities that made tactical inferiority strategically irrelevant. German veterans who wrote memoirs after the war often mentioned the T-34 with a kind of grudging respect. It wasn't a sophisticated machine, It didn't inspire the admiration that clean engineering provokes. But it worked. It kept coming. It absorbed punishment and kept fighting. And eventually, sheer persistence ground down every tactical advantage Germany's armor forces possessed. The respect came from recognizing an opponent that had been underestimated and had proven the underestimation fatal. The Soviets weren't supposed to be capable of designing and producing a tank like the T-34. The racial ideology that underpinned the Third Reich insisted that Slavic peoples were inferior. The T-34's existence refuted that ideology in the most concrete possible terms. The refutation cost millions of lives on both sides. Soviet casualties in the war were catastrophic. The T-34 didn't prevent Soviet tankers from dying in huge numbers. What it did was ensure that those deaths contributed to eventual victory rather than futile resistance. German casualties were smaller in absolute numbers, but strategically more damaging because Germany couldn't replace them. Every experienced crew killed was a permanent loss. Every tank destroyed without replacement degraded combat capability that would never be restored. The Wehrmacht in 1945 was a hollow shell of the force that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The men were still brave. The remaining equipment was often technically superior to what the Soviets fielded, but there weren't enough men or enough equipment, and bravery without mass was insufficient. The engineering inspections that began in 1941 continued throughout the war as Germany captured more T-34 variants. The T-34-85, with its larger turret and 85mm gun, prompted another round of analysis. The conclusions were the same. Soviet design philosophy was correct for the war being fought. German responses remained inadequate. By 1944, the recommendations didn't even pretend to matter strategically. The engineers documented what they found, noted the improvements, calculated the threat, but everyone knew Germany had lost the industrial race. The time when better tank design could have changed outcomes had passed. Now it was just documentation for a defeat that had become inevitable. Some of those engineering reports survived the war and became foundational documents for post-war tank development. NATO analysts studied them alongside captured Soviet tanks to understand what had worked and why. The lessons were incorporated into the next generation of Western armor. Sloped armor became standard. Automotive reliability was prioritized. Production efficiency was considered alongside combat capability. The synthesis of German technical sophistication and Soviet practical design created tanks that were genuinely superior to either wartime predecessor. But that synthesis came too late for the men who fought in inadequate machines, while better designs sat delayed or canceled. The final accounting of the T-34's impact on German armor doctrine can't be reduced to numbers or statistics. It was about institutional failure at the highest levels, about warnings ignored and recommendations delayed, and political considerations overriding military necessity, about men who died because the people who should have protected them chose other priorities. The engineers who inspected that first T-34 did their jobs correctly. They identified the threat. They explained the implications. They provided recommendations that could have mitigated the problem. But in the end, they were just engineers. They could analyze and recommend. They couldn't force change in a system that didn't value truth over comfortable lies. The comfortable lie was that German technical superiority would inevitably prevail, that Soviet industrial capacity was fragile and would collapse under sustained assault. That quality would defeat quantity because that was how warfare was supposed to work. The T-34 exposed every element of that lie in the most brutal way possible, on thousands of battlefields across the Eastern Front, in tens of thousands of engagements where sloped armor deflected rounds that would have killed a German crew, through years of grinding attrition where Soviet production outpaced German losses by margins that made eventual defeat mathematically certain. The lie cost lives that could have been saved, equipment that could have been better, chances that could have been taken while they still mattered. And in the end, when the war finished and the accounting was done, the T-34 stood as vindication of everything the German inspectors had warned about. The angle of the armor, the simplicity of the design, the focus on production over perfection. All of it had been correct. All of it had been documented. All of it had been ignored until too late. That was the real lesson, not just about tank design, but about institutions that can't adapt when adaptation requires admitting error, about systems so rigid they break rather than bend, about the distance between knowing what needs to be done and having the capability to do it. The German engineers knew the system couldn't change, and men died in the space between knowledge and action, between what should have been and what actually was.